Boldwood presents The Shop Girls Get the Vote, written by Rachel Brimble and read by Willow Nash. Chapter 1. City of Bath, 1911. In a small post office situated in one of the many back alleys that wound like a spider's web throughout Bath city centre, Esther Stanbury feigned interest in a rotary stand of greetings cards. Furrowing her brow as her impatience grew, she snuck another look at the customer talking to her friend and fellow member of the Women's Suffrage Society, Louise Marlowe. Would the grey-haired, bespectacled woman ever leave? "That's right, Mrs. Baldwin. The post office will be running a normal service, regardless of the rumours to the contrary. The Coronation will not affect the postal service for more than a day, I assure you." Louise smiled, deftly steering Mrs. Baldwin towards the shop door and pulling it open, causing the bell above it to tinkle. "There's no need to worry. Your sister will receive her birthday present in ample time." Mrs. Baldwin shook her head, her expression etched with anxiety. "But if Marjorie receives it even a day late, she will—" "You have my word." Louise gently gripped the older woman's elbow and firmly but comfortingly deposited her onto the cobbled street outside. "All will be well." With a swift wave, Louise closed the door and returned to Esther's side. "That woman will send me to an early grave, I swear." Esther laughed. "I thought she'd never leave." "Now." Louise walked behind the counter and leaned her hands on the dark wood. "What can I get you?" "Could I have some stamps and 3 small envelopes, please? I have so much correspondence to sort out for Aunt Mary. I really must get on with it this evening." "And how is your aunt?" Esther sighed. "The usual. Moody, miserable, and moaning." Louise smiled. "And is she all that's bothering you? You seemed so agitated at the last society meeting." "I was, but unfortunately, I really don't have time to talk about it now." She glanced at the clock on the wall behind Louise. "I must get to work." 2 minutes, Esther. I don't like to see you unhappy." Esther sighed and slumped her shoulders. "I'm just becoming more and more exasperated that our efforts to obtain the vote remain fruitless. Our peaceful campaigning doesn't seem to be getting us anywhere. I can't help but wonder whether the suffragettes' militant action isn't only the correct path, but the right way forward, if women are ever to be heard." Louise frowned, concern shadowing her dark brown eyes. "We are getting somewhere. We have more and more women joining the society, and last week's petition was attended by double the number of spectators than we've ever had before. You must keep the faith that we'll triumph." "And I'm trying." Esther stepped away from the counter, sliding the rolled and bound poster design she'd worked on the night before beneath her arm. "I'm just so frustrated." "We all are. But we'll see this through." Louise tilted her head towards Esther's posters. "Make the final touches, as we've discussed, and we'll present them to the others at the next meeting. We'll see victory, Esther. I know we will." Esther stared at her friend as doubt wound through her. But Louise was right. Losing faith would do no good at all. They had to stay positive and committed. Only time and dedication could change the status quo. "You're right. Belief is key." With a firm nod, Esther turned to the door. "I'll see you soon." Leaving the post office, she walked through the alleyway and along the street until she reached Milsom Street. As Esther walked, heedless of the rows of shops either side of her, a gust of wind jolted her from her preoccupation and she slapped her hand to her hat. "Oh!" A little boy beside her giggled, his hand grasped in his mother's as they passed by. Esther laughed and tipped him a wink, the brief exchange dousing a little of her mental frustration. Quickening her pace, she strode towards Pennington's, Bath's premier department store and her treasured place of work. At least she had the love of her occupation to hold close. She had to count her blessings, had to believe that being banished by her father from her childhood home because of her involvement in the cause no longer affected her. Esther had been, and would always remain, staunchly determined to continue the suffrage work her mother had involved her in from a young age. When her mother had passed, Esther's father had mistakenly believed his daughter would give up the fight. How very wrong he had been. Now, thanks to the poison Esther's stepmother had slowly dripped into her father's ear, Esther found herself living away from her familial home in the Cotswolds and, instead, in the centre of Bath with her aunt. Although Aunt Mary certainly sided with her brother and his new wife about Esther's activities, at least she had somewhere to stay and was now more active than ever as a member of a bigger and more determined suffragist group. She hurried along the street, passing stalls selling flowers, fruit and vegetables, as she made her way through the slowly increasing crowds. Inhaling the scents of horses and petrol as carriages and shiny new motor cars swept by, Esther took little notice of the goings-on around her, her mind so full of thoughts and distraction. There had to be more the society could do. Anticipation her fellow campaigners might support her new poster designs, not to mention other strategies she'd put forward, gave Esther a much-needed injection of hope. But it still wasn't enough. Again and again, they acknowledged her creative talent, had even commented that her position as head window dresser at Pennington's could serve them well in the fight. But there had to be more she could do. Nerves leapt in Esther's stomach as she battled her guilt over the growing temptation to leave the suffragist group and join the suffragettes. The differences between peaceful campaigning and militant action meant publicity for the cause was becoming feverish. Her allegiance to the society and her fellow campaigners' approval of her enrolment meant she had finally found her true place in the world, that she was valued and needed. But she could not allow their lack of progress to assuage the fire that burned deep inside of her. The familiar heat of possibility inched into her veins, and Esther stood a little taller as the mammoth shadow of Pennington's department store touched the tips of her booted toes. She neared the building, the mid-morning sun teasing her senses with the promise of summer. Esther breathed deep and stared at Pennington's facade. Painted entirely white, with two tall columns flanking the gilded double doors, Bath's finest department store stretched to 6 stories and encompassed everything a consumer could wish for. From hats and gloves to jewellery, toys and perfume, Pennington's was a store that inspired and influenced, a promised land where people from every walk of life came to shop, take lunch and socialise. Straightening the lapels of her uniform jacket, Esther hoped her appearance wasn't below par. For the past year, Pennington's had prided itself on its new staff uniforms and the unity of everyone who worked there. As head of a small team of 4 women and 3 men, Esther liked to think the pride Elizabeth Pennington had in the dresses department was justified. Esther stepped forward, only to stop again. A man stood in front of one of the store windows with a little girl and, judging by the scowl on the girl's face and the exasperation on the man's, father and daughter were in the throes of debate.
"But, Daddy, I want the cricket set, please."
"Why don't I buy you the doll? And if you don't like it, we can change it for the cricket set another day."
"But—"
"Dolls are for girls, Rose. Cricket sets for boys."
Esther narrowed her eyes as she approached them and the young boy, standing a little to the side, who she assumed to be the man's son. The little boy bounced a ball against a paddle, seemingly oblivious to the redness of his father's and sister's combative faces. The man held his daughter's hand while pointing towards one of Pennington's huge picture windows. The colourful and flamboyant toy display beyond had been erected by Esther and her team just a few days before. She stopped beside them, clutching her handbag in tightened fingers. Rightly or wrongly, she could not walk away from the gentleman's clear fault in the argument.
"Excuse me."
The man straightened, and Esther resisted the urge to step back. He towered over her by at least 6 inches, his broad shoulders only accentuating his physical dominance over her petite 5 feet 4 inches and, some might say, too slender frame. Forcing a smile, she pushed down her irritation, all too aware she represented Pennington's, and rudeness to a potential customer was always to be avoided.
I couldn't help overhearing your words to your daughter.
His bright blue gaze bored into hers. And I don't believe it's anyone's place to say what another person should prefer, whether adult or child, male or female. He arched an eyebrow, the exasperation in his eyes softening to amusement, which only hitched Esther's temper higher. Her smile faltered as she struggled to maintain a semblance of pleasantness.
I see.
He slid his hand onto his daughter's shoulder, her hair shining in a sheet of glossy brown down her back. Esther noted it was the exact same colour as her father's, which peeked from beneath the edges of his hat.
Rose is something of a conundrum. Yesterday, dolls were her favourite thing in the whole world. Today, it's cricket. As for Nathaniel here,
he touched the little boy's head.
Yesterday he was convinced the sky was always only blue, whereas today it's blue and grey.
Esther lifted her chin.
That is neither here nor there. If your children—
Are you a mother, Mrs.?
She almost corrected his presumption of her marital status, but quickly snapped her mouth closed. He had no need to know her title or name. He had no need to know anything about her.
I'm not, but I know the importance of choice as well as anyone.
Yet how would you understand a confrontation between parent and child when you have merely caught the briefest of moments in what has been an argument lasting—
He pulled a gold pocket watch from his waistcoat.
15 minutes.
Esther held his frustratingly calm gaze and fought to muster her wavering confidence. His impertinent question regarding her maternal status had thrown her from the subject, but he was right to question her. What did she really know of children, of parenting? Heat crept into her cheeks, but she stood firm as she turned her attention to his daughter rather than her imperviously forthright father.
Do I find myself standing in front of a keen cricketer?
Esther beamed at the little girl, who grinned back.
Could you be the first young lady to join the men at the Oval?
The little girl giggled as she sidled closer to her father, her head bobbing up and down. Esther laughed before addressing the little boy.
And I agree, the sky is most definitely blue and grey.
The boy flashed an impish grin, and Esther straightened, glancing at their father. Her smile vanished at the intense way the gentleman studied her. She cleared her throat.
Your children are delightful, sir. I would just like certain people to see that it's important every human being, no matter how young, is allowed the liberty of choice.
His gaze lingered on hers until he blinked and looked along the street as though bored by her conversation.
I see.
Esther glared at his profile before remembering his children watched her. She forced a tight smile.
I can't imagine your wife would approve of you encouraging such a division in your children.
He stilled before facing her, his blue eyes wholly darker than they'd been before.
My wife?
Yes, sir, your wife. Is it not enough that women are forced to fight for a position in the world without—
We're discussing a doll and cricket set. Hardly an argument for or against women's suffrage.
2 spots of angry colour now darkened his cheeks.
That's what you're referring to, correct?
Esther swallowed and glanced at his children before tilting her chin at their father.
Not in this instance.
He raised his eyebrows.
No?
No.
That's just as well.
He glanced along the street.
As an active suffragist supporter myself, I really wouldn't appreciate you casting aspersions without knowing me.
Surprised, she lowered her tense shoulders.
You support the cause?
He faced her.
I do, and have for many months.
Her heart quickened and she turned away from his penetrating gaze. So he was one of the men supporting the women in their fight. That did not mean he could hoodwink his daughter into convention.
Well, as pleased as I am to hear that, sir, we clearly have a long way to go with regards to gender equality. The cause is just one aspect of women's rights that needs to change. Wouldn't you agree?
Indeed I would. I imagine the fight to close the avenue between the sexes will be an ongoing one for many years to come.
Exactly. She looked at the young girl and smiled. Do you think we've persuaded your father you should have the cricket set?
His daughter shook her head, but her eyes shone with mischief.
Daddy is stubborn.
Trying not to laugh, Esther nodded.
Yes, I believe he is.
The gentleman coughed. Esther faced him, disconcerted by the unexpected softness that had replaced the defiance in his eyes.
Well, it seems you have found a friend in Rose, if nothing else.
Yes, I think you could be right.
She smiled at his daughter, delighting in her happy gaze, before she turned to the little boy.
And I have in you too, I hope.
He nodded, his smile impossibly enchanting. Their father cleared his throat.
But new friends or not, that doesn't mean I'll weaken in my decision about what to buy them.
Of all the obstinate... She pointed to the window.
This display was purposely designed to amalgamate children's interests and tastes. Do you see nothing is segregated? Nothing clearly marked as boys' toys versus girls.
His gaze momentarily dropped to her mouth in such intense study further heat flared in her cheeks. The man had an unnerving way of examining a person, as though he could look at her and see something beyond what she presented to him. It was annoying, supremely annoying. He slowly turned to the window. That is the dresser's intention?
Absolutely.
And you can be quite certain of that because...
Because, sir, I am her. My motivation behind this design was to show it's neither here nor there which gender chooses to play with which toy. Why not allow children to be children, regardless of whether they are male or female?
Esther's pride swelled.
And with that thought, I will bid you good day.
She smiled at his children in turn.
It was lovely to meet you all. Goodbye.
Esther marched past the family towards Pennington's open double doors. That told him. The way he'd looked at her, almost as if she entertained him. Well, maybe next time he'd think twice before declaring what was or wasn't a suitable toy or pastime for his children. It was attitudes like this that held back progress, that scuppered the cause's efforts time and time again. Taking a deep breath to calm herself, Esther walked through Pennington's doors into the glittering, brightly lit atrium. The mammoth space was bursting with activity, customers strolling arm in arm around the glistening counters and dressed mannequins standing on platforms dotted throughout. Wide-brimmed hats and tailored suits provided a seemingly endless flow of colour. At Pennington's, dancers and actors, gentry and businessmen shared the same space with middle-class housewives, labourers, or nannies with prams. The sight of such equality never failed to brighten Esther's most sombre mood. When Elizabeth's father, Edward Pennington, had finally seen sense and passed the store's reins to his daughter, Elizabeth had quickly and decisively implemented changes that meant the demographic of Pennington's shoppers instantly modernised, from being shamefully elitist to encompassing people from every walk of life. The struggle Elizabeth had gone through to be valued and respected by her father had bordered on painful, but she'd succeeded in her endeavours, despite the odds stacked against her. She'd utilised every ounce of her passion and drive to do all she could to help female workers labour towards an equal footing with men. To encourage and inspire belief in the department heads and their staff that the stark differences between men and women was a thing of the past at Pennington's. Working alongside her new husband, Joseph Carter, Elizabeth retained her maiden name for her professional life only. As her friend, Esther knew only too well how much Elizabeth relished being Mrs. Carter, not as a sign of inferiority or bondage to her husband, but as a proud public acknowledgement to a man she loved and respected. Someone who had been far below her social standing when they'd met and fallen in love, but despite the obstacles, Elizabeth and Joseph had fought her father in order to spend their lives together. Her love for her husband was tangible whenever Esther was near them, whether in the workplace or socially. They were a formidable team, and one Esther felt honoured to work with. Esther lifted her gaze to the sunlight that flowed through the glass dome, casting pink, blue, and green in every direction, prismed by the huge chandeliers hung throughout the seemingly endless store. She smelt the soft scent of perfume mixed with the sweetness emanating from the numerous bouquets of flowers standing in vases on marble plinths, and breathed deep, as love for her job and the people she worked with hastened her steps and demolished her temper. Esther weaved through the throng towards the stairs leading to her department in the store's basement. She was thankful Elizabeth had agreed she could start work a little later this morning. The 10-hour days she'd worked for the last month to get the toy window display finished, as well as adding bits and pieces to the store's plans for the upcoming coronation, had finally taken their toll, and, added to the constant and growing demands of her aging aunt, Esther's focus had woefully drifted. Something she'd never allowed to happen before, and was determined to rectify. Her constant need to prove herself had become an obsession. She inhaled, an obsession she feared she'd never satisfy. Her father's rejection of her and her ensuing need to feel worthy of her mother's belief in her had meant Esther worked hard, often foregoing fun in a bid to succeed in her work for the cause and here at Pennington's. Her desperate need to feel valued and wanted sometimes hung over her like a heavy cloud, and she had absolutely no idea what or who would make that change. All she knew with the utmost certainty was that she'd never give up until she'd succeeded. Chapter 2. Lawrence narrowed his gaze as he continued to stare at the doors through which the blonde, exceptionally beautiful young woman had disappeared. Rose and Nathaniel chattered and giggled around his legs, seeming to have forgotten about her, if only the same could be said of Lawrence. He pressed his lips together as annoyance gathered inside him. He had not liked being beaten to the final word on such a conversation. What had possessed her to show such clear disdain towards a complete stranger? Yet it was incredibly difficult to dismiss such a strong, beautiful, clearly intelligent woman who'd smiled so softly at his children. Every part of him wanted to go after her, finish the conversation on his terms rather than hers. He glanced at Rose and Nathaniel as they chased one another in circles about him on the bustling street, heedless to the crowds separating around them as they shopped, hurried to work or elsewhere. Lawrence inhaled a deep breath as rare indecision badgered him. It was a fine day, and he should forget the woman and take his children to the park. It was Saturday, after all. It was his personal rule that he never worked at the weekend, unless there was an unavoidable crisis at the Phoenix, the prestigious hotel he owned, situated in the very centre of town. Lawrence was more than content to leave the running of his premises in the hands of his capable staff from Friday evening to Monday morning. Over and over, Rose and Nathaniel had asked him if they could feed the ducks, followed by eating an ice cream on Victoria Park's immense grassland. They had only stopped outside Pennington's to momentarily look at the window display that had so mesmerized his children. Then, before he knew it, their day had been derailed by a complete stranger.
Daddy?
He dragged his gaze from Pennington's doors and looked at Rose.
What is it, darling?
Can we have the cricket set? Please?
His daughter stared up at him with heart-rendingly beautiful blue eyes, her hands clasped together in pleading.
Nathaniel and I will be the best behaved we've ever been, I promise.
Lawrence fought back his smile, his resolve broken by one look into her eyes, so similar to her mother's.
So, you'd rather we went shopping than to the park?
Yes,
Rose enthused.
Yes,
Nathaniel chorused. Lawrence shook his head, his smile breaking as Rose and Nathaniel clasped hands and leapt up and down.
Fine shopping it is.
His children whooped with delight, and Lawrence grasped their hands as he led them into the store, secretly pleased by this unexpected change of plan. Pennington's atrium was lit in all its glory, people walking back and forth as he searched over their heads for a sight of only one female. She'd said she was responsible for the store window, so the chances of seeing a dresser on the shop floor were slim. But still. He tightened his fingers around his children's hands.
Right, the toy department, I think.
As they headed for the lift, Lawrence's mind filled with ponderings of his late wife, whom he had shamefully not thought of for many months. Abigail had died 4 years before, during Nathaniel's long and painful birth, a tragedy that resulted in an untimely end to her life and, in turn, hers and Lawrence's arranged marriage. Throughout their brief time together, he and Abigail had tried to make one another happy, to find more than a semblance of joy within the entrapment in which they'd played willing marital and financial pawns. Although he never came to love her as he'd hoped, Abigail had been a wonderful mother, beautiful both inside and out, and Rose grew more and more like her every year. Intelligent and caring, his wife had taken interest in their staff, both in and out of their home, as well as being an active charity worker and support to Lawrence in his work. Theirs might not have been a love connection, but there was every possibility their lives would have gone along well enough had Abigail not died. Her death had ripped through the heart of their family life, and Lawrence counted himself immensely lucky they had such dedicated and loyal staff that he'd been able to rely on to help raise the children these past 4 years. The experience of their marriage and Abigail's horrible and wasteful death had diluted any serious intention Lawrence had towards women ever since. Except he couldn't completely eradicate his belief that his children deserved and relied on him to find a new mother for them one day. A mother he loved, someone else to unconditionally love them. The closest Rose and Nathaniel had to a mother figure came in the form of their nanny, Helen, who adored everything about them, cared for them as if the children were her own. But that was where her service ended. Lawrence's relationship with Helen, his butler, Charles, and Mrs. Jackson, the cook, was one of employer and employees. Nothing more, nothing less. They were a team who silently looked out for each other and worked together for the good of the children. When Lawrence would actively begin to seek a woman to take Abigail's place as his wife and the children's mother was anyone's guess, including his own. Burying his melancholy, Lawrence rode the lift with Rose and Nathaniel, smiling at the young male attendant, who they learned was named Henry. The young man's kind face and wide smile had quickly won them over, especially when he'd allowed Rose and Nathaniel to take turns pressing the buttons as people entered and alighted the extravagant gold and red velveted lift. They stopped on the 3rd floor, and Lawrence took his children's hands again as they stepped out.
Thank you, Henry. These two will want to come back again tomorrow after your generosity.
Not a problem, sir. Enjoy your day, children. The lift doors had barely brushed closed before Rose and Nathaniel whipped their hands from Lawrence's and raced along the carpeted landing towards the marble pillars outside Pennington's toy department. Lawrence followed them and scanned the space for a glimpse of the woman who'd accosted him outside. He glanced at the abundance of games, toys and dolls stretched out before him. Shelves and tables were bursting with every conceivable distraction for children, from the very young to early adolescence. What was he doing here? Why was he even remotely concerned about speaking with such an audacious female? Well, for one, her eyes were the brightest, prettiest shade of hazel he'd ever seen, her hair thick and blonde, pinned beneath a hat she wore with panache and style. Then there was her mouth, bow-lipped and painted the softest pink, and finally the passion in her tone, the lift of her determined chin and the challenge in her gaze. Everything about her had aroused his interest. Lawrence pulled back his shoulders, and he would prove to her that he was equally au fait with the rights of males and females as she appeared to be, and then depart the store with his pride intact. Not give her another thought. Why should he leave her to her clearly mistaken assumptions about him? He had every right to defend himself and set the record straight. He looked around the department again, an unnerving disappointment she was nowhere to be seen, nagging him. Rubbing his hand over the back of his neck, Lawrence slowly strolled around, his gaze flitting back and forth to Rose and Nathaniel as they picked up and replaced toy after toy. Nothing had looked quite as spectacular in Pennington's as it did nowadays. Rumours and gossip had indicated a change in management this past year was responsible for the renewed, more jovial atmosphere, and Lawrence couldn't help but acknowledge the improvements were all for the better.
"Daddy, Daddy!"
He snapped his gaze to Rose as she and Nathaniel each held up a cricket set wrapped in dark green netting. Despite the window dresser's impression of him, he'd had every intention of buying the set all along. It was her presumptions that had riled him enough to quarrel with her. Now he'd have the immense pleasure of showing the woman the cricket set Rose and Nathaniel had chosen. Wandering towards them, Lawrence shook his head.
"We don't need two. Pick one and you can share it."
Their smiles dissolved as they looked at one another with determination burning in their blue eyes, their mouths pinched with disappointment. Stifling his smile, Lawrence continued on his slow walk, picking up puzzles and balls, not really seeing any of the things he touched. His attention wandered towards the exit. Would she be in the ladies' department? He had absolutely no idea where a department store dresser would work.
"Might I help you, sir?"
He turned and smiled at the young shopgirl who'd approached him.
"My children are just bickering over a cricket set. I'm fine, thank you."
"Can I interest you in anything else today? We have a new supply of toys just over there in the corner, all of which are featured in our window displays. If you'd like to—"
"The window displays." Lawrence coughed and smoothed his tie. "I think I might have met one of your dressers earlier. She quite impressed me."
The girl smiled.
"Was she blonde? Pretty?"
"Yes, that's her."
"Well, Esther impresses everyone. She's fabulously talented and kind." She laughed. "Everything, really. Oh, and funny when she comes out with us in the evening, which isn't as often as we'd like."
"Esther. That's her name."
He fought not to sound overly interested, but feared his voice betrayed him.
"Yes, sir. Esther Stanbury."
Lawrence nodded, trying hard to ignore an inexplicable triumph that reverberated through him.
"I'd like to speak with her. Would you be able to point me in the right direction?"
"I'm sorry, sir, but she works in a department out of bounds to the public, although you might find her in the ladies' department. She spends a lot of time there discussing future displays with the head of the department and Miss Pennington."
"Fabulous. Then I'll—"
A tug to his jacket sleeve made Lawrence dip his gaze to Rose and Nathaniel standing beside him.
"Aha! We've chosen, have we?"
They nodded in unison, their eyes bright with happiness once more. He took the cricket set and held it out to the shopgirl.
"Just this for now, please."
"Of course." She smiled at the children. "Why don't you follow me and I'll wrap your gift for you?"
Lawrence slowly followed the shop assistant and his two overexcited children, impatient to get to the ladies' department. He wanted to show Miss Stanbury. He frowned. Was she a miss? She hadn't corrected his addressing her as Mrs., and he hadn't thought to check her hand for a wedding or engagement ring. Well, married or not, he refused to leave their exchange unfinished. He was a successful hotelier with plenty of money in his pocket, a lovely home on the circus, and two beautiful children. Since when did he lose face in a confrontation? Never. That's when. Walking to the counter, Lawrence paid for the cricket set, and Rose and Nathaniel hurried from the department ahead of him. He strode to catch up with them and placed a hand on each of their shoulders, steering them towards the grand staircase that wound from the bottom floor to the top.
"Let's take the stairs to the second floor. I want to see if we can show your cricket set to the lady we spoke to outside."
The children walked beside him, Rose tightly clutching the cricket set. Never had Lawrence been so grateful for their obvious disinterest. He was beginning to feel decidedly, uncomfortably idiotic pursuing Esther Stanbury this way. But as soon as he stepped into the ladies' department, his gaze was drawn to her despite the number of shopgirls and female customers wandering around. She had her back to him, talking to a red-haired woman dressed in an expensively tailored suit and heels higher than he saw most women wear. She was stunning, there could be no argument about that, but it was Esther who drew his eye. The two women leaned side by side over a broad sheet of paper, talking in earnest as Miss, or Mrs. Stanbury pointed with the nib of a pencil to different spots on the sheet. Purposefully harnessing his previous irritation with her, he gripped his children's shoulders and halted them a few feet behind the women. He cleared his throat.
"Excuse me, Miss Stanbury?"
She started and turned, her eyes immediately widening.
Mr.
"Culford. Lawrence Culford."
He slipped his hands from Rose and Nathaniel's shoulders and came forward, his hand outstretched, all too aware that, once again, she hadn't corrected him about her title, which meant he was still none the wiser.
"I'm glad to have found you."
Her fingers barely grazed his before she pulled her hand away, her cheeks darkening as she glanced towards her red-haired colleague and back again.
Can I help you with something?
"I think you can, yes."
Another glance at her colleague.
Oh?
The woman held out her hand. "Elizabeth Pennington, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you."
"And you."
He turned to Rose, gesturing her forward with a wave.
"Show Miss Stanbury your present, Rose."
His beautiful daughter beamed as she held the cricket set aloft, Nathaniel standing tall and proud beside her.
Daddy bought me the cricket set.
Miss Stanbury looked from Rose and Nathaniel to Lawrence and back again, her face lighting with a smile.
Well, look at that. I'm so glad your father saw sense in the end.
She met Lawrence's gaze over their heads, her eyes glittering with victory.
That's wonderful.
He stared at her, his smile fixed and his heart pounding with frustration. Did the woman not hear how condescending she sounded?
"Wonderful or not, I thought it important you know I am not the tyrant you clearly considered me."
Dragging his gaze from hers, Lawrence looked at his children.
"Come on, Rose, Nathaniel. Let's leave the nice lady to her work."
He took their hands before looking at Esther once more.
"It was interesting meeting you."
Her gaze shadowed as she glared, her smile too bright to be sincere.
I hardly thought you a tyrant, Mr. Culford.
"Good, then the matter is settled."
Even though the matter felt strangely less settled than it had before. He turned towards the department exit and didn't look back, regardless of the almost overwhelming urge to do so. The woman had infuriated him, bewildered him, and left him feeling she'd ended the conversation on her terms once again. Damnation. Chapter 3. Esther turned back to her latest sketch, fingering the brooch at her throat with slightly trembling fingers. Why on earth had Lawrence Culford sought her out? She'd barely given the man a second thought since she entered the store. Yet clearly he thought of her. Why? She neither wanted nor needed a man's attention. Lawrence Culford might have two of the most delightful children she'd ever met, and yes, he might have a certain something that appealed to her sensibilities, that jumbled her sensibilities, but he was still an ill-mannered fool. It was of no consequence how much she missed being part of a complete family with a mother and father. It was of no consequence that she missed her parents every day since her mother's death and her father's estrangement. She could not allow this man's strange need to seek her out and laud his decision to buy the cricket set for his children to shake her new independence. Self-reliance was the only way forward in this newly emerging world. She had her colleagues. She had friends both here in the city and at home in the Cotswolds. What did it matter that she no longer kicked up her heels at parties and gatherings as often as she once had? She still laughed and joked from time to time, still found joy in the company of those she worked with. So she no longer had her beautiful, caring, passionate mother to confide and whisper with, but she had others she was coming to care for, slowly reaching out the hand of friendship. Especially Louise, and the woman standing next to her. Remembering Elizabeth beside her and feeling decidedly discomforted, Esther smoothed her skirt and lightly patted her hair, steadfastly avoiding Elizabeth's gaze as it burned into her temple. "Esther?" She turned, an automatic smile slipping into place as she snatched her hand from her hair.
Yes?
Elizabeth raised her eyebrows, her gaze amused. Do you know who that man is?
No, and neither do I want to. Clearly Mr. Culford had no care for the fact I'm working when he chose to interrupt us. Just another indication of his character.
Esther looked pointedly at her latest design, determined Elizabeth not be concerned by Mr. Culford or his ability to unsettle her professional aptitude.
So, what you'd like for me to do is...
Esther Stanbury, look at me. Briefly squeezing her eyes shut, Esther opened them again and faced her employer and friend.
Yes?
That man is Lawrence Culford, the owner of the Phoenix, a man who sadly lost his wife a few years ago. In childbirth, I believe. Esther's heart twisted in sympathy.
He's a widower?
She glanced towards the entrance, hating that she'd been so short with him and that she'd referred to his wife when they'd been outside.
I didn't realise.
And I'm sure you also didn't realise quite how wealthy he is or how he's admired around town. Elizabeth followed Esther's gaze towards the entrance of the ladies' department. Or that he is quite the mystery. Although, by reputation, kind, handsome, and unassuming, he's also someone who is rarely seen at social occasions. Elizabeth's hushed tone ignited Esther's curiosity, even as she tried to quell it.
Well, if he's a father raising his children alone and running a hotel, I would assume he wouldn't have time to be social.
Maybe. Elizabeth put her hand on her hip and narrowed her eyes. But I can't help wondering why he has you so flustered.
I'm not flustered,
Esther retorted a little too quickly.
I'm just... busy.
The man is as handsome as they come and has 2 beautiful children, and you say you're not flustered. I was flustered, and I happen to be deeply in love with Joseph. Lawrence Culford has a presence, I think. How does he know you? And what is the significance of the cricket set? Esther waved her hand dismissively.
Oh, it was something and nothing. I ran into them looking into Pennington's window and overheard him say cricket sets are for boys, dolls for girls. We had a short conversation and that was it.
Elizabeth arched an eyebrow. And you expect me to believe your exchange was no more than that? Knowing when she was beaten, Esther slowly laid down her pencil and folded her arms.
Fine. I might have confronted him more than I conversed.
Elizabeth's smile immediately dissolved, concern sparking in her dark green eyes. Confronted him? A customer? Esther, you know you have to hold your tongue.
Oh, trust me, I did.
Feeling like a chicken puffing her feathers, Esther battled to keep her righteous anger in place.
The man is an ignoramus.
Is that so?
Yes.
She pushed a stray curl back from her cheek, culpability uncomfortably pressing down on her.
I wanted him to understand that girls shouldn't be limited by toys they're given, and do you know what he had the audacity to say to me?
Elizabeth glanced towards the department exit, clearly unhappy. Were you rude to him?
Well, no, of course not.
Esther? Her heart quickened and she grimaced.
No, I was merely firm.
Elizabeth studied her, her canny gaze boring into Esther's before her shoulders relaxed and she shook her head, making her deep red curls softly sway. You shouldn't push your views onto our customers. Our job is to ensure they come inside and spend their money. Having said that, it seems Mr. Culford concurred with your opinions enough that he gave in to them and sought you out to tell you of his transformation. You clearly snagged his interest. She gave a knowing smile. I suspect in more ways than one. Heat warmed Esther's cheeks.
Don't be silly. The man is nothing more than a father trying to push his viewpoint onto his young daughter. If he came to tell me about his purchase, it's because he wanted the last word. Nothing more, nothing less.
Elizabeth turned back to the design sheet. I'm not convinced, but let us get back to work. Esther released a shaky breath. Crisis averted. At least, the crisis that Elizabeth might push her for more information about her exchange with Mr. Culford. As for the crisis going on inside of her, that was a different matter altogether. He was widowed, possibly raising his children alone. Did he presume her to be a game target for his attention? Or was she being presumptuous? Annoyance stirred, Esther forced her concentration to Elizabeth as she spoke. We need to expand on housewares in the west window, I think. If we include another set of dining... Esther's mind wandered once more. As much as she needed to think badly of Lawrence Culford, she somehow couldn't align him with anything entirely bad-tempered. In fact, his rising to her challenge of acquiescing to buy little Rose the cricket set and then seeking her out spoke of a man who was willing to admit he could have been wrong, of a man willing to apologise even if he hadn't quite managed to utter the word, which meant there was every chance she had misjudged him. The cut of his clothes, his upper-class tone, and impeccably dressed children indicated a man of money and status, one who'd almost certainly received an expensive education and was more than conversant with the ways of the world, a man not a million miles from her father. Yet the two of them were beyond compare. Mr. Culford had said he supported the cause. Had he recognised her from a demonstration or rally? Seen her petitioning on the street? Maybe it was that which had led him to seek further contact with her. Could he be a possible ally to the society? Deep curiosity whispered through her as she tried to listen to Elizabeth. So, moving on to your design for the forthcoming coronation, Esther frowned, but she hadn't seen him at the local suffragists' meetings, nor at any public petitions. Yet why would he lie about being a suffrage supporter if he wasn't? There seemed no reason why he would so vehemently tell her of his involvement unless he truly cared about it, which made him even harder to dismiss from her thoughts. And to be frank, I really think the standard is slipping, Esther. Jolted from her thoughts, she turned to Elizabeth. I'm sorry? This design isn't up to your usual excellence. I hate to say it, but I'm a little disappointed. Dread and shame twisted inside Esther as familiar fingers of insecurity crept along her spine. Elizabeth had never said such a thing about her work before. Her position at Pennington's was as vital to Esther's heart and mind as the cause. Swallowing against the sudden dryness in her throat, Esther frowned. What is it that disappoints you? I think it lacks your usual sparkle, your flair. Pennington's windows are, of course, your and your team's doing, but it's your designs I rely upon to astound people, to entice them inside. It's your skill that makes people desperate to purchase that hat, that purse, that toy, that necklace. Design ideas for the coronation need to be bigger, brighter, and more spellbinding than anything you've done before. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She paused. How many coronations do we get to celebrate? The city is already simmering with anticipation. Can you imagine how that will grow and swell as the day comes ever closer? Elizabeth stepped back and splayed her fingers on her hips, her eyes bright with excitement. Milsom Street will be filled with well-wishers, balloons and banners. We need those people to stop at our windows, be inspired by our wares, and congratulations to King George V. She slumped as her brow furrowed. I worry you haven't got the passion for the store you once had. Concern clouded Elizabeth's eyes and her voice softened. Unless, of course, it isn't the store bothering you, but something else entirely. Although Elizabeth's excitement had gone some way to reigniting Esther's anticipation for the upcoming coronation, words and explanations about her father, her demanding Aunt Mary, and the pressures of performing well for the society flailed on her tongue. How was she to confess her hardships to Elizabeth? They were friends, but it was imperative she maintain professionalism while they were at the store. Esther looked to the design, battling the stinging in her eyes. I'll do better. I promise. Elizabeth gently touched her arm. Esther, please tell me what's worrying you. Is it the suffrage movement? I imagine things at the society continue to escalate with every passing week. Esther slumped her shoulders. I have been more and more wrapped up in the society.
Clearly that has been detrimental to my work here. I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
Don't apologise for something as important as the vote. I wish I could do more than support you by listening and suggesting things, but if I'm seen as any more active,
it could affect the store, I know. But I'm determined to make a difference, do something to enable a breakthrough. Do you not read in the papers the lengths some women are going to in London?
Passion sped Esther's heart, her need to do something more, burning deep inside. Although Elizabeth supported the cause and did as much as she could, the movement was not as crucial to her.
There are more arrests, more force-feeding, but these women do not falter or step down. It's been 2 years since Prime Minister Asquith came under attack in Birmingham, 2 years since Winston Churchill was assaulted in Bristol, yet nothing has changed.
What are you saying? Concern clouded Elizabeth's gaze, and she lowered her voice. Please tell me you are not considering joining the women in militancy.
I don't know. All I do know is I feel I'm failing to take up the mantle that my mother left behind. She prepared me for this path. She took me to rallies, explained militant and peaceful action, made me read the newspapers with her. I have a passion for the vote like nothing else, but my work here...
Esther's heart picked up speed.
I sometimes feel I'm letting myself and my mother down so badly.
She reached past Elizabeth and started to roll up the large sheet of paper, regretful she had said so much.
I'll work on this tonight and have something better for you in the morning.
Esther, please look at me. She lifted her eyes to Elizabeth's. Her friend's gaze was astute and steady. I care about you. You do know that, don't you?
Of course.
Whatever your efforts for the cause, you are making a difference, and your mother would be so proud of you. We will win this fight. We have to. Elizabeth continued to consider her a while longer before she lifted her hands in surrender. I'll leave you to see what else you can come up with. Why don't you take until the end of next week? That will still give us plenty of time to get things organised.
I'll start straight away.
Before Elizabeth could say anything else, Esther took the rolled design sheet from the counter and hurried from the department. How could she have allowed even the slightest doubt and lack of confidence to appear in Elizabeth's mind? Without her work to distract her, Esther would be back in the dark hopelessness she fought against daily. Her work at the store and the society should buoy her, but sometimes a horrible inferiority surfaced, as though her father's anger and resentment would forever hold her in its grasp. She had to find the strength to see through what had drawn her to Bath. Her desire to be in a city, in the thick of the fight, had become so vital to her integrity she had not fought for her right to stay at home, but walked away, her head held high, albeit her heart broken. She would never be what her father wished her to be, a woman who was happy to stay at home and do her husband's bidding, a woman so different to who her mother had been when they first married. Her mother had changed over the years. Esther knew that. She had told her as much, and Esther was so grateful she had. If her mother hadn't been inspired and impassioned by female progression and exposed Esther to an alternative existence, there was no saying what her life might have looked like today. She had to cling to her blessings, her talent, a wonderful job, the cause, things she would not give up, couldn't give up, not for anyone. Pushing open the door to the design department, Esther glanced at her colleagues as they worked side by side. These people were her team, her achievement, and she would protect them with everything she had. As much as she loved her work for the cause, she also loved her role at Pennington's and needed to ensure her concentration on her job never faltered. Lawrence Culford flashed into her mind, and she quickly pushed away the image of his handsome face. Thinking about an interesting, outspoken man with an attentiveness to the fight would do no good for her survival. No good at all. She had to focus on creating a bigger and better window for the coronation, astound Elizabeth and, in turn, the hundreds of people who would line the streets on the 22nd of June. Just 6 weeks from now, Great Britain would have a new King-Emperor, and maybe George V would be the new figurehead of hope the women of this country had been waiting for. She wished for that more than anything. Chapter 4. Lawrence hit the cricket ball with controlled force towards Rose where she stood in front of the stumps on the green outside his townhouse, situated in the famous circus. Pride swelled inside him as his children ran to retrieve the ball. He'd provided them with a lovely home and enough food to fill their bellies, enough warmth that they should never feel the chill in their home as he had within the cold corridors of his family's manor house in Oxfordshire. Yet, time and again, his fierce determination to protect his children's happiness felt threatened, as though at any moment his father would rise from the grave to beat him again. His mother looking on, her eyes alight with malicious satisfaction as this time they left him for dead and assumed guardianship of Rose and Nathaniel. He stabbed the bat into the grass and looked around the circle of houses and the people gathered on the green for the impromptu cricket game. The sun shone high in the sky, and the first shimmers of hazy heat warmed his raised face. Yet it had no hope of melting the ice around his heart. Once heir to the Culford estate, Lawrence's father had raised his son with an iron hand, determined Lawrence would know hardship as he, James Culford, had. How disappointed Lawrence's parents must have been when they realised their son would be neither a boy nor a man, with a drop of superiority, cruelty, or abuse in his nature. Lawrence glared ahead. Those particular family traits had bypassed him and his elder sister, Cornelia, and instead showed signs of manifesting in their snobbish, money-hungry younger sister, Harriet. Yet, because she was female, their parents were adamant Harriet would not inherit. So, Lawrence was dealt every ounce of James and Ophelia's frustration and disappointment. No matter the mask he wore in front of the children, his staff, colleagues, or friends, the fact remained Lawrence was damaged. Damaged and afraid. So very afraid that, beneath his carefully maintained veneer, he could one day be provoked and reveal a deeply buried anger, proving all too clearly he had bad Culford blood running through his veins. How was he to be everything Rose and Nathaniel needed him to be when such bitter, hateful thoughts about his childhood and parents marred his mind and blackened his soul? Would he ever fully breathe while his mother was still living with Harriet and continually dripping venom into his sister's ear? He had fantastic neighbours, glorious friends, 2 beautiful children, and more money than he could ever need. His money, not Culford money, but money earned through his arduous work, investment savvy and a burning need to get away from a mother and father he resented to the very soles of his feet. Although lonely and desperate for something, someone, to show him real love was possible, Lawrence was scared to fall in love, find comfort in a lover's arms. What if his masquerade were to slip, and that woman learned of his weakness and cowardly obedience as a child, as a young man? Yet something had to change before he fell so far into his discontented abyss that he lost all hope of ever climbing out again. If he were to ever stop believing himself a better man than his parents' cruelty had made him, he would give up and lose everything. He had to find a way to destroy that man, pulverize him, for his sake, but most importantly, for his children's sake. Sickness churned deep in his stomach. He'd gone on to marry a woman of his parents' choosing, a woman he didn't love, yet he'd sired children with her so they both might find a modicum of happiness in the eyes and comfort of their babies. He'd kept his promise of marriage, yet ensured the shame of who he'd once been remained hidden. Its reality continued to twist in his blood, making him burn with rage and frustration behind his closed bedroom door. His only course was to live his life for Rose and Nathaniel. Maybe an inauthentic life in some ways, but one where his children only knew their father to be happy, smiling and playing. But how could he deny his children the potential to be loved and nurtured by a female touch he could never give them? At the sound of footsteps, Lawrence turned, nodding at Charles, his butler and confidant of the last 4 years. Lawrence's bogus smile slipped easily into place. "Ah,
You come bearing refreshments. Good man. Rose, Nathaniel, come and have a drink."
Rose threw the ball to one of the neighbours' children and raced towards Lawrence, Nathaniel doing his best to keep up with her on his short 4-year-old legs. They each took a glass of milk and a biscuit from Charles's tray, the butler pulling his face into an almost impossible expression that sent the children into fits of giggles. Lawrence grinned.
"Go and take your treats to the bench under the tree. You look hot and bothered."
The children walked away slowly, carefully balancing their drinks and biscuits as Lawrence took a glass of lemonade from the tray.
"They're enjoying themselves, I think. It's nice to see so many of us out here using the green. It felt like a very long winter."
A young woman walked past them, hand in hand with a toddling boy, and glanced at Lawrence from beneath lowered lashes. Esther Stanbury immediately leapt into his mind. She was the antithesis of the woman who smiled at him so shyly, yet she continued to poke and prod at his memory. He looked at Charles.
"I met someone yesterday. A woman."
"Oh?" The butler's grey eyes widened in surprise, his eyebrows almost brushing the edges of his black hair.
"And?"
"And she intrigued me," Lawrence admitted, adding a shrug in the hope the gesture might deflect the depth of his interest, considering how often Esther Stanbury had entered his thoughts in the last 24 hours.
"I should have been infuriated by her. But I'm man enough to admit it's not infuriation I'm feeling whenever I think about her." "Then what are you feeling?"
He took a deep breath, surprised and confused by his sudden need to share his meeting Esther with Charles. Although Lawrence encouraged a much more personal relationship between himself and his staff than his parents would ever have considered, his candour did not bode well for maintaining his carefully tended control.
"Nervous."
Charles raised his eyebrows.
"Nervous? I'm surprised by that. You have never struck me as nervous about any situation." "And far too curious." "I see."
Charles looked across at the children.
"And what did this woman do that should have infuriated you?" "It's difficult to say. Her whole demeanour was of a nature I've not come across before, not even with the suffragists. It's as though Miss Stanbury is willing to fight for what she believes is right, even if she has to stand alone. She's quite remarkable."
Charles smiled and pulled back his wide shoulders.
"Well, that is interesting. Will you be seeing her again?"
Lawrence sighed, indecision warring with a sanity inside him.
"To do so would undoubtedly be foolish. But I can't help thinking I'd enjoy her company. In a friendship way, of course. Romance is the furthest thing from my mind,"
he insisted.
"Of course."
Charles laid the tray on the grass and crossed his arms, his gaze on their neighbours as they walked or ran across the grass.
"But there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with this young woman?" "On the contrary."
Lawrence flashed a genuine smile.
"She's beautiful, clearly intelligent, if not a little too opinionated. Passionate, most definitely fond of children, and, for some reason I'm yet to identify, has well and truly captured my attention." "May I ask the lady's name?" "Esther Stanbury."
Lawrence frowned. He'd actually savoured her name on his tongue, and he didn't doubt she'd taste as softly sweet as the lingering scent of her perfume, which incessantly clung to his nostrils. Where on earth were such thoughts coming from?
"She's a working woman, a woman my mother would undoubtedly disapprove of." "I think your mother's approval, one way or another, no longer matters to you, so why not ask this lady to dinner? She can only refuse, and then you'll know for certain if your meeting with her was nothing more than an encounter that momentarily threw you off balance."
Charles raised his eyebrows again.
"Because that is how you're feeling, isn't it? Off balance?"
Lawrence nodded, ridiculously grateful his butler had named the absurdity currently threatening his self-preservation.
"Indeed."
Rose and Nathaniel approached them, wearing matching milk moustaches, complete with biscuit crumb sprinkles.
Lawrence stepped forward, his momentary lapse in attention to them quashed. They mattered more than anything. His children had to come first. His own wants, his own desires, could not overshadow what mattered most, his children's happiness and raising them in a loving and secure environment. The strange and inexplicable urge to get to know Esther Stanbury was of no consequence. She wasn't the right woman for him to pursue, even if such a miracle were to ever arise. How would such an independent woman with views and strong opinions, however just and right, ever be happy staying at home and helping raise another woman's children? Because that was the kind of spouse he should want. Only a woman who wanted to be with Rose and Nathaniel would suffice. His children deserved that singular commitment and unfailing devotion. They needed to know they were loved above all else. He had to be careful, had to maintain his willpower. To make a mistake could affect Rose and Nathaniel in ways from which they may never recover. An arranged marriage, even a marriage of convenience, would eventually fail, and he would not re-expose his children to the heartache he'd slowly managed to pull them out of when they'd lost Abigail. A truly loving and obedient woman who'd been nothing more to his parents than another person in their plans to continue their self-made lineage and increase the family wealth. His chest tightened as isolation gripped him, and Lawrence quickly swiped his hand over his face, the scuff of his jaw rasping.